Massena, the first pre-dreadnought for which I will conduct this entire review whilst blindfolded. Towards the end of the 19th century, the Royal Navy stopped experimenting with endless 1 and 2 ship classes and began to build battleships in large numbers, specifically the Royal Sovereign class. The French, having recently abandoned the jeune école style of warfare and now desperately trying to catch up in capital ship development, issued a law calling for a couple of dozen battleships to be built, which was somewhat ambitious. But they intended to start with 4 ships in a notional class. But unlike contemporary British practice, which involved designing a ship first and then issuing the drawings to various dockyards, the French approach was to lay out a set of minimum and maximum specifications and then let the winning bids pretty much write themselves as long as they stayed within those parameters. The requirements that were initially laid out were that displacement would not exceed 14,000 tons, primary armament was to consist of a mixture of 340mm or 13.4 inch and 274mm or 10.8 inch guns. The belt armour should be 450mm or a touch under 18 inches, and the ships should maintain a top speed of 17 knots. The secondary battery could be one of 2 calibers, with as many guns fitted as space would allow. No specifications were given for superstructure, hull form, engine layout, or gun mounting type outside of the main battery. However, even these were being changed after the initial designs had been called for, with a new 305mm or 12-inch gun replacing the 340mm weapon, and political arguments leading to an unofficial downgrade of displacement to 12,000 tons. As a result, Massena would emerge from its design process with a main battery of 2 305mm guns in a pair of single turrets, one forward and one aft, a secondary battery of 2 274mm guns in a pair of wing mountings that were half turret, half casemate, a tertiary battery of 8 single 138mm or 5.5 inch guns, 4 to a side, in similar mountings as the secondaries, a quaternary battery of 8 single 100mm or 3.9 inch guns, which differed from the previous ships in the same ostensible class, which had used 65mm guns in this role. Then, what I've now discovered is called a quinary battery of a dozen 47mm guns, and a senary battery of 8 single 37mm guns. Plus, of course, 4 single submerged torpedo tubes, in case they didn't have quite enough weaponry mounted on this thing. Also in a break with previous French battleship tradition, including those ostensibly of the same design specs, Massena introduced a 3-shaft propulsion system compared to the 2 on her now half-sisters, which allowed her 14,000 shaft horsepower to push the ship up to 17 knots. Respectable, but a knot slower than the designers had hoped for. A 5th ship of the same ostensible class was also added at around about this point, which meant that even the original spec for a 4-ship production run was actually now out of date. Her designers also went with a somewhat novel hull form, whilst others of the loosely defined Charles Martel class tried to at least have a continuous hull form all the way up to the main deck. Massena's designers appear to have gotten one deck above the waterline and then gone on strike, leaving presumably some poor building designer to be dragged in off the street in order to meet a deadline, and he sketched the rest of the hull built as a monolithic hotel block with plenty of windows, so that's what the ship completed with. Massena would also suffer from significant issues with stability, as she was designed to an even lower specification of displacement of about 10,800 tons, but finished almost 1,000 tons heavier, which, amongst other things, meant that her armour belt mostly protected her from particularly aggressive fish species and not incoming shellfire. But for all the justifiable ribbing that she gets for her hotel block superstructure, they at least didn't go with the industrial crane and girder upper or flying superstructure that plagued some of her half-sisters, which meant that she would avoid the fate of HMS Captain. The ship's armour was steel, running up to almost 18 inches thick, in a shallow main belt, with numerous different thicknesses protecting the turrets, the fore and aft ends of the ship, decks, and bulkheads. She was laid down in September 1892 and launched in July 1895, commissioning into the Marine Nationale in June 1898. The first part of her career was as flagship of the Northern Squadron, based on the French Atlantic coast, until in 1903 she was transferred to the Mediterranean Squadron as part of the Reserve Division, her long time to completion having run through a period when battleship technology was advancing very rapidly. In a rather interesting exercise during this period, the newly commissioned Suffren was chosen to test the resistance of a new armour plate design, and the Marine Nationale decided that the best way of doing this test was to strap the new plate to one of the main battery turrets on the new ship, replace the turret crews with sheep, and then have the Massena pull up right alongside and shoot it at point-blank range. Amazingly, they didn't actually inflict critical damage on the newer ship, instead actually damaging themselves when a splinter from a shell impact punched a hole in Massena's hull. Despite the outbreak of World War I, the ship was considered too old and obsolete for active service by 1914, and so her only part in the conflict was to be expended as a breakwater for the protection of the Allied evacuation of Gallipoli in 1916.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.